Okay, so today what we're doing is we're starting to look at the paradigms and cases in gender and agreement. And this is really relating to chapter 3 in our textbook. As always, I'm going to fill in some background and some context. So I'm going to talk about understanding declensional and inflectional paradigms, looking particularly at English, actually. Then we'll talk about a couple of the cases. Sorry, I shouldn't use that word. A couple of examples, meaning particularly strong nouns and demonstrative pronouns. And then we're going to talk about agreement and word order, case and gender versus sex, sort of sex. And the point here is that this is where English and Old English get quite different. And then you can see here, so we're talking about chapter 3 in McGillivray, and I've got a couple of handouts as well that you may or may not find interesting. And there we go. Okay, so we know this a little bit, particularly if we're a second language learner of English. We as first native speakers of English, those of us who are, may not actually be quite as aware of this formally speaking. We have to know it or else nobody else would understand you. But formally speaking, we may not be aware of it. But people who've had to learn English as older, older children or teenagers or adults will be well aware of this. And we have several subclasses of nouns and verbs. And these are known as declensional or inflectional paradigms. Declensional for nouns and inflectional for verbs. And I'm just giving you some examples. So out of nouns, here's a whole bunch of different ways that nouns can be declined. You can have a regular noun like girl, plural girls, possessive girls with a apostrophe, we're writing it out, or S apostrophe. Then you have words like woman, woman and woman, or man and men. And then you got a whole other category, mouse versus mice, plural mice. You've got child, and then one of my favorite ones, the double plural of children. You've got sheep versus sheep, maybe, or sheeps, or who knows, sheep, fish, fishes. You've got foot and feet. And then in certain contexts, in certain dialects, you've got foot as the plural as well. So I don't think we can say that out here, but in Ontario, in Toronto, where I'm from, when you go to a lumber store, you order 12 foot. You want a 12-foot 2x4, for example. You use what sounds like the singular for it, but I have 2 feet. And I guess if I was some kind of caterpillar that had 12 feet, I'd still say I had 12 feet, but I'd still order a 12-foot 2x4. Stone, by the way, is like that in the UK. Some people will say stones, but when they mean the weight, they'll say stone for plural. You have fish, and then I don't know what the plural is. Fish, fishes. I know mobsters think that you sleep with the fishes. I don't know if the FBI think that you sleep with the fish, or you sleep with the fishes. I don't know what a mobster grammarian would say. And then you've got words like pups, pups, or puppies. And I mean that by words that end in Y and then IES in the plural. And then you've got other strange ones like, for example, alumnus and alumni, syllabus and syllabi, alumna and alumnae, those kind of things. And the same is true in verbs. We've got our regular verbs, things like love, loved, loved, I love, I loved, I was loved. And then you've got verbs like drive, drove, driven. I drive, I will, drove, I was driven. Blow, blew, blown. Break, broke, broken. Do, did, done. Lie, and then I don't know. I lay, I laid, I lain, I laid. Again, different dialects will have it slightly differently. Speak, spoke, spoken. And then a completely different kind of verb, am, was, and been. So we know that you can have these. And then each of these has a different way of doing the same, indicating the same grammatical. So you've got girl, the same grammatical function. So girl is the general case. You'd use it for the subject or the object. The possessive is girls and written with an apostrophe. In the plural, it's girls with an S, and the plural possessive is girls. Sounds exactly the same, but we write it with an apostrophe after the S. And then you've got child. So you've got child and child's, but children and then children's in the plural possessive. Sheep and sheep's, the sheep's skin. And then I'm not sure for the plural, but you got probably sheep. And then I'm not sure what the plural possessive of sheep would be. These are the sheep's skins, I guess. Maybe S apostrophe. I'm not sure how we'd spell it, but it would be sheep's, I'm thinking. You have syllabus and syllabi, and then I don't know, depending on how pedantic you are, syllabis or syllaborum, or who knows. If you want to be really, really pedantic, you could argue that you're really borrowing this from the 18th century where people misunderstood it as a fourth declension, in which case it would be syllabus, 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 syllabus. Mouse and mouses, or mice, and then mice in the plural, and I don't know, mices, mouses. So I caught 4 mice in my trap. The mouses' noses were crushed, or the mice's noses were, I don't know how to do that one. I haven't actually discussed capitalism with a lot of mice, so I don't really know how they possess things. But the point is that we've got all these different words that do the same thing. So on the one hand, every row is quite different, but every column, if you can imagine every comma being a column, is actually doing the same function. The first row is the subject general form, subject object form, this in the singular. Second one is the possessive form in the singular. This third row after the slash is the plural general form, subject or accusative or prepositional object. And then the third one is the possessive plural. And the same is true of verbs. So this is exactly the same chart as it was before, but the first column before the solidus is the present tense, not third singular, and also the infinitive. The second one is the regular past tense, and the third one is the past participle, the noun or the adjective form, right? So the loved man, the driven woman, the blown chance, the broken back, the done deal, the laid tile, the spoken word, and because they've been there, done that, but that breaks the pattern. And so again, on the one hand, the rows are different, but on the other hand, the columns, in terms of what they're doing in the sentence, are the same. So they have different ways of doing the same thing. Whenever you're able to talk about rows and columns, you can put them in tables. And so this is then, it's quite common in learning dead languages, in sort of the older traditional way, philological way of learning languages, to put them in what we call paradigms, which is actually where Kuhn gets his idea of paradigms from, that you change the paradigm, you change the table by which you understand how things are laid out. That's where he gets his idea of the paradigm shift from. And so here I've done the exact same thing that I did on the previous one, except now I've laid them out as tables. So girl, I've divided it into singular and plural, and I've divided it into the general case and the possessive case. So you've got girl, girls, singular and plural, or girls, girls, possessive. Remember, language is oral, not written, really. And so when we're speaking this, there is no difference between girls, 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 all 3 of those girls. The apostrophe or not apostrophe is a graphic clue. It's not an oral clue. You can't hear the difference. So it's actually even, there's basically girl, and then the rest of them end in S. Next one over, I got mouse, mice, same thing. I've got on the first row the general case, the subject and the object case. In the singular, it's mouse. In the plural, it's mice. In the possessive, it's mouses, I'm guessing. And in the plural, it's mices, or I don't know. Same for child, child and children. In the general case, singular and plural, and child's and children's. This one, by the way, is really cool. This is one of my favorite ones because it's actually got a double plural. It's child, and in some varieties of English, you can actually say childer, and some Germanic languages as well, meaning that's more than one. But I guess before the 1960s and the advent of reliable birth control, children came in braces, not just a couple. So they needed like a double plural So you had children, and then, oh my God, have you got children? And the same is true with possessive. You've got child's, and then you've got a heap of children's owning something. And finally, sheep, whatever you do with that. You've got the same. So you can put these things in paradigms, and whoops, sorry, I seem to have doubled up that one. I think I meant to put in the verbs. You can do the same thing with the verbs, where you can lay them out on a chart. Simple past, simple present, simple past, past participle. When we get to Old English, it's the same, except there's just more of it, and it's a lot more at a surface level. It looks a lot more regular. And that's not because it's not regular, it's because English looks a lot more irregular at a surface level than it actually is. In English, we just have a lot of vestigial declensions forms, but in Old English, they have really multiple versions of every single one of those. So we have lots of words that decline, like girl, stones, boys, trees, tiles, coat hangers. All of those words follow the same chart, the same paradigm as girls. We don't have, I don't think, any other words that follow the same pattern as children. And we don't have a lot of words that follow the same pattern as mouse, mice. And we only have a few words that do the foot thing, you know, where when you're counting, like 6 foot. We've only got a few words like that. So in English, it looks like we've got how you do nouns and then a whole bunch of regular ones. But in Old English, they just have a whole bunch of different regular ways of doing it. Some are much more common than others, but nevertheless, there's generally a number of each kind. And they also have more things that can be declined. In English, the only things that we can put case on are personal pronouns and nouns. So I, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, they, and then I can go me, you, him, her, it, us, y'all, them. So I can put case. In fact, our personal pronouns can have more case than other things, and our nouns. But in Old English, they can put it on nouns, adjectives, and all pronouns. And then, as I said, several of those have regular subclasses, where in modern English, basically, we have the main class, and then we've got vestiges of the other classes. So there's a class called weak, which we'll talk about, and then there's several kinds of strong verbs. And somebody had mentioned comparing it to Latin. In fact, when you look at the cheat sheet, I've actually helped line them up so that if you have learned Latin, the Old English, I've lined the declensions up so you can figure out which ones are first declension, second declension, third declension, if you want to do comparative across your Latin, for example. Same is true of their adjectives. They have different ways of putting case on adjectives. In this case, it's not intrinsic to the word. So if you think about girl and child, it's just intrinsic. Girl always has to be a plural in girls. Child always has to be a plural in children. In Old English, it's the same thing. Stan, which is a strong masculine verb of the same kind as girl in modern English, has to be stanes. It has to be a strong noun. But in adjectives, they have the same thing, and they actually look quite similar. But whether you're strong or weak depends on how you're used and where you are in the sentence. So each adjective, or in most cases, can be either strong or weak, depending on how it's being used. And then pronouns, you have gender-based declensions in the sense that, I mean, that's also true of the nouns and the adjectives, but every pronoun is different, whether it's masculine, neuter, or feminine. Adjectives too actually have different endings for whether or not they're agreeing, and we'll come back to that, with masculine or feminine or neuter nouns. And then finally, they have more distinctions than we do. So in those paradigms that I showed you a few minutes ago, we only had 2 cases, really. We had a general case, which you could use as subject or object, or the prepositional object, and then you had, or an indirect object, and then you had a possessive case, really a genitive, because it can be used for more than just possession, but we'll call it possession for right now, and that was it. And the personal pronouns, we have three cases really. We have a subject case, an object case, and an indirect object case, let's call it. Sorry, a genitive, a possessive case. But they have way more. So in the nouns, they generally have four, with a fifth showing up in, well, sorry, they have four on nouns: nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative. And we'll talk about what they mean in a few minutes. In adjectives and on demonstrative pronouns, they actually have the remnants of a fifth case, an instrumental case. It shows up on masculine pronouns and on masculine adjectives that are agreeing with masculine nouns, but we don't have to worry about that too much. It doesn't come up very often. They have two numbers, just like we do, singular and plural, but they actually have a third that shows up in pronouns, a dual, meaning exactly two. And they've got three genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. And these are grammatical genders, as we'll say in a second. And so this here is just cut out of that cheat sheet that you can get on my site. And Rachel and Dylan also have some access to some other ones that we can show you. In fact, I'm thinking of adding, based on that, to this. There's a number of them around the world, mostly North America probably, but and they all have pretty much the same stuff on them, except one or two have a couple of other things I really should add. The reason I'm showing you this, though, is just to show you how many they have. So if we start over, let's start at the bottom. That bottom table is all the regular ways that nouns can appear in Old English. So these are the different types of nouns, equivalent to girl, mouse, woman, all those different forms, except in this, there's examples of every single one of them. So for example, you've got weak nouns. And remember I said, one of the rules of Old English is, if there's ever a choice, call it strong, weak, doesn't matter. That's just how we do stuff in the field. So you've got weak nouns, and they can come in masculine, feminine, or neuter. So nama is an example, name. Suna is another example, a feminine one. Aya is another example, a neuter one. And then you can have strong nouns, and they have different patterns depending on what they are. So you can have the sort of the regular kind that we were looking at and Murray's talking about when he calls them strong nouns, a word like stan, meaning stone, and then ship, which is a neuter noun. It belongs to the same group. It has slight differences because of gender, but it's basically the same kind. And word, which is a slightly different kind of neuter noun, also belonging to the same category as stan. And then there's feminine nouns like yifu and lar, or Murray's using brud, I think. And they have a separate set of endings. They still sort of belong to the same broad category, but they have separate endings. And then you've got a whole bunch of other ones like man. That's where our man, men, woman, women comes from. But they have other words in there. For example, book is like that. So book actually goes the same way that man does. The plural of bok in Old English is bech, just as the plural of mon is men. So you can have other words that take those. And then you've got these strange family words like fader and motor, and they basically don't change at all. And then they've got a little bit of a strange ending in the plural that distinguishes them from everything else. But if you look at those, they basically don't have any endings. And then you've got a final category, which can be masculine or feminine, of ones that, again, have just a really strange endings as well. But the difference between modern English and Old English is, in modern English, we might have one or two of some of these, and so we don't think there's a pattern anymore. But in Old English, they've got multiple examples of each. And so they think of it, well, I don't know if they think about it because they're native speakers, but somebody learning Old English would have to think about these in terms of the different paradigms. And that's just the nouns. So then you go up to the adjectives. Well, actually, let's do the pronouns first. That demonstrative pronoun column, those 6 columns, is how you say the. And it just depends on what you're doing. So if you're saying the stone, you have to use the masculine nominative singular version of the, which is sa. But if you're saying the gift, that's a feminine word, so you have to say the feminine singular nominative, seo yifu. And so They have a whole bunch of forms then that go all the way down all these characters, all these different forms. And then finally, as you can see from adjectives, adjectives take different forms depending on what they're doing in the sentence. And they can, the same adjective can either be weak or strong. And so I've got examples there with goda. So if I wanted to say the good eye, well, aya is neuter, so I have to use fat, neuter, nominative, singular, and then I have to use the weak declension. We'll talk about this at the end of the year. We have to use the weak declension, so I have to say fat, goda, aya. And if I just wanted to say a good eye, I have to say god aya, because you have to use a strong one if it's by itself. Don't worry, that's a ton of information. The reason why I'm showing you this now is to provide the context for the little bit we're doing now. So what I've done thus far, and I saw there's a question from Sydney, what I've done thus far is I've shown you how we have the same sort of idea in English, but it's way smaller. It's a bit bigger in English, in Old English. And now what I'm going to do, having shown you the huge range that it fits, we're going to come back now to the two that we really have to pay attention to, which are strong nouns and demonstratives. And so Sydney says, is there a way to tell if a noun is feminine or masculine, or is it just a matter of memorization? Yes and no. The answer is no, you can't, in the sense that there isn't necessarily any logic to it. As I'll say in a couple of slides, Old English is grammatical gender. That means it's arbitrary and formal, but it doesn't reflect it. Modern English speakers often have trouble with this idea because English is in many ways a sex-based language. That is to say, gender changes depending on the speaker's understanding of the gender of the object that you're talking about. And so in our case, we think that gender is intrinsic to the object that we're looking at. But if you come from a language where gender is grammatical and arbitrary, you don't necessarily see that connection. So the famous example is in German, women are neuter and turnips are feminine. And there's no reason for that. It's not like Germans have a turnip fetish. It's just that that's the way it works out. And the same is true in Old English. So in Old English, what you'll see is that children are, well, depending on what kind of child you're talking about, it could be neuter if it's barn or masculine, but women are neuter, with, and men are not. Oddly, it turns out men end up assigned to the right gender. I mean, I imagine this is a unique example in history where it seems to work out okay for men, but nobody else. But men end up generally getting the right gender assigned to them in our terms, but nobody else does. Okay, so yeah, so the answer is that, but why it's not memorization is because if you look at the sheet that I've got on the screen right now, they have different endings. So in something like French, where you just basically have to know because you need to know if you say le or la, right? But there isn't any real endings on the words, so you can't tell. But in Old English, if somebody says to you in a sentence in the singular, seo yifu, you know it's feminine because of the seo and because of the u ending. It could only be a couple of other things. It could be a masculine u stem or a neuter plural. But you can tell from the endings in context whether something is feminine or neuter. Or masculine. And since we don't have to produce Old English, you don't actually have to memorize it. You if anything, memorize the endings, the paradigms, and then you fit the words into that. All right. Any other questions before we go and talk about strong nouns? All right, not hearing any, I'll continue. So I said that they've got all these multiple things, and strong nouns is the ones that Murray's looking at today, and that's often the one we start with. And so what I've got here is to show you the different declensions for the different genders, right? So we've got stan is an example of a masculine noun, and that's its pattern, equivalent to girl, girls, girls, girls. So you've got stan in the nominative singular, and stanas in the nominative plural, and you've got stan in the accusative singular, and you've got stanas in the accusative plural. Again, we'll talk about what these mean in a second, these cases. stanes in the genitive singular, stana in the genitive plural, and stane in the genitive, dative singular, and stanum in the dative plural. And I've done a couple of things on this. Things that are in reverse field are always the same for every gender in every form. So all nouns in Old English in the plural nominative and the plural accusative are exactly the same. That's true of no matter what declension it is. And then the bold things that I put up are either exclusively that ending, that only means that, or it's so common that if you ever have to guess this. So es, for example, is pretty much always genitive singular. Scribes will occasionally make mistakes. You know, you might see es on when it's really accusative or nominative plural, but in practice, in a textbook, if you see es, it means masculine genitive singular. Likewise, if you see if you notice, dative plural is always If you see that means dative plural, and if you need a dative plural, it means on a noun. Actually, on pretty much everything. That a is very common at the end of genitive plurals. It shows up elsewhere, but probably the most common use is on genitive plurals. Also shows up, for example, feminine weak, I believe nominative. Masculine weak nominative. It shows up like nama. So I've shown them out there. So we've got stan, the masculine strong noun. We've got a neuter example, bairn, meaning child. This is the modern Scottish word bairn, if you know that. My family are all from Glasgow, and they talk about the bairns. It's the same word. And then you've got brud, related obviously to our word bride, and it's a feminine word. I generally, if I was choosing these, I'm not sure I'd choose brud as that, because I think it helps cement the idea that gender works the same way in Old English and Modern English when it doesn't really, but nevertheless. And then we also have to look at the demonstrative pronoun. You can see it's all laid out here. And this is exactly the same as the sheet, but you've got the first column there is the masculine form in the singular. And you can see that NE ending, thona. If you see NEs on things, it's not really an ending there, but NE is an extremely characteristic masculine accusative singular ending. So for example, the strong masculine accusative singular of good, meaning good, is godna. So if you see na on something, it's almost certainly masculine accusative singular. The only times that's not true is if the word happens to end in N and it's got an E on it, for example. But if the ending is an NE, then that's what that means. They're sort of under the genitive. If you imagine, if you break ash in half so that it's an A and an E, you can kind of see how that ES is showing up again on the genitive singular. The dative for adjectives and for pronouns the dative ends in M. There's that sort of like the coming back, although the is only dative, in pronouns it can be dative singular, but it's generally dative, almost always dative plural. And then you've got that instrumental, which we won't see very often, and the only time you ever see it, it'll be there. This instrumental, by the way, despite the fact it's a vestige in Old English, it survives to this day. You guys actually use the instrumental case on your demonstrative pronouns without knowing it. Or maybe you are so smart you do know it, but you probably don't. Some people know, because I've told them, but actually you'll never guess. I'll ask, does anybody know where we use the instrumental? But I'm not going to give you long to decide because you don't know. All right, nobody said. Okay, you use it when you say the more the merrier. If you stop and think about that phrase for a second, the more the merrier, you'll go, what the hell does that mean actually? The boat, the car, the dog, the cat, the house, the boat, the more the merrier. And also, wait a second, more is not a noun. So how am I using the with, I can't say like the blue, If I say the blue, I'm turning it into a noun. I mean, like, I don't know, it's the name of a band or something. But the more is not the name of a band. It's the more the merrier. That's some kind of phrase. And so what does that mean? Well, what it means is by this much the more, or actually by that much the more, by this much the merrier. Meaning I will be more merry depending on how many of these more people I have. And what that actually is that's a survival of the thu. So it's not the same the as we have in like the car or the boat. What happens is, remember I've said in my section, hopefully if you haven't heard it, you're hearing it now. The history of English, basically from Germanic on, is a history of losing the quality of final syllables, turning them into schwa, and then dropping them. So going from, oo to nothing. And what happened there is that thu over time just became the in the Middle English period, and then the, but we fossilized it in that phrase, the more the merrier. And that's an actual example of the instrumental case at work. It's the only one I can think of. I mean, you can use that construction. The happier, the richer, the happier. I mean, it's a productive construction, you can use it. But it's the only example I can think of. And that's an actual survival of a case-based phrase using the instrumental, which is already considered archaic in Old English. So don't say you haven't learned something useful in this class. Okay, so then in the feminine, you've got some other stuff. The EO, again, it's not really an ending, but words that have that EO there, that is a really common feminine singular nominative. Other example is heo, hea, the word for she, also nominative singular feminine. The r at the end of gare is also really common in the feminine on genitive and dative singular. Neuter, got the same thing. Nominative and accusative neuter are always the same. Fat. You've got that thas and tham for the same reason as the masculine, so it's really common es or e or m. And then in the plural, we don't have the distinction from gender. So no matter whether it's masculine, neuter, or feminine, they all have the exact same demonstrative pronoun, and that's also true of adjectives and everything else. For adjectives, they basically have the same endings. Again, the reason why tha is in black reverse field is because in everything, the nominative and accusative plural is always the same. Thara, this one, I guess I can't. Let me back it up one. I really jumped ahead there. Thara, ra or a is again really common in the genitive plural. We already saw that with stana, for example. And there, it doesn't say famum at the end there, but you can see that M showing up from dative plural as well. So one of the things that Murray points out is that there's a lot of duplications and ambiguous forms in this. And so if you just look at this noun chart, well, the first thing is you got that big reverse field row at the plural that you can't tell a subject from an object by its case endings, right? And the nominative and accusative is always the same for neuter nouns in the singular. And then you've got things like the weak nouns where basically everything except the nominative singular, the genitive plural, and the dative plural ends in an, right? So if you look at naman, if you just see the word naman, you can't tell, is that accusative singular, genitive singular, dative singular, nominative plural, accusative plural, just by looking at it on its own. Yifu, you've got yifa. All the oblique cases, accusative, genitive, dative, they're all the same. So you can't tell by just looking at that word. And so amongst other things, that means unlike other inflected languages, where there's much more intrinsic distinction between the cases, in Old English, they can't 100% rely, certainly not on individual words and their endings, to tell the sentence apart. So English would be hard, although in theory, as I've said last lecture, and I'm going to say again, in theory, the Anglo-Saxons relied on these endings, these little flags almost, to say, this is what I'm doing in the sentence, I'm the subject, nominative. They can't actually just move the words anywhere they want. That sentence that I gave you last time, and I'm going to show you again in a second, is actually impossible in Old English. You couldn't do it like that. Some other languages you can. Greek, for example, is a lot freer. Latin could be, but isn't, or at least has a fair bit of fixed word order and expected word orders. But in Old English, you can't 100% rely on that. So that sounds like it causes difficulty. And in the textbook, Murray really talks about that as saying, so in a certain sense, they have these, but you can't rely on them. But I don't think that's really 100% true because of agreement. And so if you think about not the individual word, but the phrase, then actually things are often a lot less ambiguous. And so this is a completely different concept from what we have. Except in one place in English. Agreement means that if one word is something, the other word has to be that too. Now, we don't have a lot of places where we have agreement in modern English. So the goes with masculine or feminine or neuter or plural, doesn't matter, doesn't change. All of our adjectives, it never changes, depending if it's singular, plural, masculine, feminine, possessive. The good girl, the good girls, the good girl's bike, the good girls is bikes. Good is the same each time, as was the. The only place where agreement shows up in our case is between those, that and those. So you can use that with singular and those with plural, and with persons, personal pronouns and verbs. So you can say, I go, you go, he goes, where goes and he are agreeing with each other. Those are really the only places in English where we have agreement. But in Old English, because so many of these things have endings on them, they have to have agreement. And this is actually where Old English is less ambiguous than you might think looking at the chart. And so what I've done is, on this one, I've written out example words in each case with the demonstrative, with an adjective added, and then just with an adjective to show you how you can tell a lot more. It's not quite as ambiguous as it looked. So masculine singular nominative, so König. So go to König is the good king, masculine singular nominative still. But if you were just to say a good king, you'd have to say God König. And as you look at that, you can see between so and goda, I can tell that it's nominative. And König in the next line, where it's accusative, is no different. So you couldn't tell. If I just said König, you can't tell if I mean subject or object. But if I say Thona König, Thona is definitely accusative. So I know that König in that case has to be accusative as well. Thona Godan König, Godan could be just about anything, but the fact that it's between Thona and König tells me it's got to be accusative as well, as does König. And then if it's on its own, Goldna König, there's that NE again that shows up meaning a masculine accusative singular. And so if you go through these charts, you'll see that that's true always, with the exception maybe of the neuters. That basically you can pretty much tell, as long as it's not appearing on its own. If it's appearing as part of a phrase, you can pretty much tell what it is most of the time. And so as we go farther along, you're going to finding this agreement, figuring out what goes with what, is going to be really key to our translations. And then I've got plural down at the bottom. So this is really different from modern English because we have way fewer cases. We basically got possessive in general, really not possessive, and we only have it on nouns and personal pronouns. But Old English has these 4, plus the 1 vestigial, with specific grammatical functions. So this is the same thing I said last lecture. The nominative is the same as the subject case, the thing that we would indicate by saying I, right? So if I can replace, Beowulf goes to the store, if I can just say I'm Beowulf, I would say I go to the store. Beowulf must have been in the nominative, it's the subject. The accusative, which is the object case, the one that you would replace using me or him or them. The genitive case is very much used for possession, but also a lot of other things, is one that you could replace with my or apostrophe S. Genitives are also used for other stuff. For example, habitual time. So Tuesdays, I like to go to the store. That Tuesdays is not plural, it's actually an all genitive. Dative, it's used for interest, oblique connection to the sentence, not subject, not object, but somehow otherwise connected. And I always recommend every time you see a dative or you recognize a dative, write in by, with, to, for above the word, because we very commonly translate those using prepositional phrases now. And then instrumental, which means by or whatever, and it only shows up in 2 places, so don't worry about it. You'll recognize it whenever you see it. And then the other reason why agreement is really different is because Old English uses grammatical gender, which is formal or arbitrary, versus natural gender, which is what we have in modern English. And so in modern English, we have masculine, feminine, and neuter. We're in the process of creating non-binary, which we can do. And the reason why we can do that is because in our case, the gender we assign to something using a pronoun is, in our minds, depends on what we understand the gender to be. So for example, the word man we think is masculine because we think men are masculine. Woman is feminine gender because we think women are feminine. Child is masculine or feminine depending on which kind you think it is. Stone is neuter because we don't think stones have gender. And dog, well, it really depends. If you're talking about a dog, you could use it or you could use masculine or feminine. But in Old English, it's an arbitrary distinction. So man, they also thought that men were men. It was masculine. But with, they also recognized that women were feminine people, but it was a neuter word. Stone, on the other hand, is masculine, not because, women are always choosing between men and stones, just because it's arbitrary that they decided that whenever you say the stone's lying there, he is big, you're supposed to use he. And hund is masculine. Again, no real reason, because they also had female dogs, but that's what it is. And bairn is neuter. And there's no explanation for that. It just, in fact, a lot of these go back into Indo-European. I saw somebody in the blog had said, well, in Russian, these are different. As a rule, the etymologically connected words should be the same. So if it's the origin, if 2 languages have a word for moon that's based on lune in some way, they should also all show up as feminine. I think it is in French. And so what that means is finally that these are, is another reason why agreement is so important. But because of this gender issue, that's why they can agree. And this is basically the same slide I used last time. Old English is very much a flag language. It has these endings which tell you what the function is. And modern English is a slot language. We know that something is what it is because of where it is in the sentence. And so in theory, an Anglo-Saxon could say, they actually can't say this, but they could say, the queen her daughter the sword gave. I guess they could maybe say that in a subordinate clause. So I actually can take away the asterisks. But we have to move them around. So we have to look nominative. Okay, that goes in the first slot. That's where our subjects go. We have to find a finite verb. That's over at the end, third singular preterite. So we have to put it in the second spot because that's where our finite verbs go. And then depending on how you're doing your indirect object, the first object, if there's 2 objects, the first one's the indirect object. So her daughter was dative, the by, with, to, for case. If I'm going to do it this way, I put it next. Or I have to put sword there and then say to her daughter or with her daughter or something. And so we have to move the slots around. As we go on, I'll emphasize this is actually very powerful, recognizing that we're moving from flag to slot, because once you have a sentence in modern English where you know what every slot is doing, all you have to do is replace each word with the Old English word that's in the same case, and you will naturally build the sentence correctly. And actually, I've already picked this up, that it's actually not quite as ambiguous as you might think looking at the paradigms. And then finally, we do have examples that show that scribes privileged case over word order. That is to say, at the end of one version of Cadman's hymn, the cases break down and they don't understand what something is. And you can see it's the only place where the scribes freely point. They put periods in trying to figure out where the end of the sentence is. And normally scribes are very consistent. They follow whatever their master manuscript did. But in this case, it's completely different. Every manuscript's different as they try to work it out. And there's some other examples of that as well. And
Excuse me, Dr. O'Donnell.
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. Would you please post these slides so I can study from them?
They
Because
always
I
are.
can't. Okay, sorry, thank you.
And so if we hear me go to the store, we think it's a dialectal variant of I go to the store. But to an Anglo-Saxon, it would be as nonsensical as my go to the store. They'd sit there and go, I see an object, I see a verb, and I see a prepositional phrase, but I don't see a subject. So I don't know what me goes to the store means. And I also don't know how you can go somebody. Like, how do you, I can understand you hit somebody, but how do you go somebody? The sentence doesn't make sense. In the same way that my go to the store, you can't figure out what I mean. So just to conclude here, basically, remember that it's theoretically different, and they really did think of it differently, because even when the word order is the same, they're not thinking about it the same way as you. And so really, in the beginning, with these easy texts, you can pretty much go left to right, first word subject, second word verb, third word except in subordinate clauses, but don't do it. Write down nominative, finite verb, accusative, because it rapidly becomes harder. And you really want to force yourself to pay. You got to force yourself to be like the early medieval speakers, that if you don't understand the grammar or the inflections, you don't understand the sentence, even if you think you could make a sentence out of it in modern English word order. So, it's like accidents on country roads, right? There are no accidents except for the fatal ones. So there's no problems with cases and word order in modern and Old English until there is, and then it doesn't make any sense anymore. So start thinking about it now. And then I've said to a couple of people, a quick tip is to take a text, once we're into the glossaries, if you're really interested in this, go buy a concise Old English dictionary like Clark Hall's Concise Dictionary of Old English and use it and a cheat sheet instead of the gloss at the back. And then you'll be really training yourself to think like an Old English speaker, because you'll be analyzing the compounds and you'll be looking up the endings and really forcing yourself to figure out what something is. So that's it. I have time for a quick question if there is one, but unfortunately I have to run to another meeting. Great, not hearing anything. You'll be in your sections next time.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you.